All right, Samson. Well, we've heard a lot about Samson, and he always seems to get in trouble and do some of the same old things over and over again. And when we open up chapter 16, we're going to discover pretty much that same category. So let's read verses 1, 2, 3, and we'll start from there. Now, Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her. When the Gazites were told, Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. They were quiet all night, saying, in the morning, when it is daylight, we will kill him. And Samson lay low until midnight. And then he rose at midnight, took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and two gate posts, pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them off to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Well, as we open up this chapter, we can already see that he's going back to the same old, same old. It says he sees a harlot, and he goes in with her. It's obvious that here's sin once again. A clear example of how a man used of God can also sin, and sin blatantly. He wanted to be used by God, but he also yielded to that sin. He kept the external features of being a Nazirite, as obviously his hair, but at the same time, he kept sinning with this particular prostitute. Well, interesting, it says that he put the gates of the city, the doors of the gate of the city and the two gate posts, and he pulled them up and he carried them on his shoulders. Well, despite his sin, even though he did sin, God still gave Samson supernatural strength to escape from the Philistines. God did this because God's purpose was bigger than Samson, and because God used Samson despite of his sin, God used him in spite of that instead of what he was doing. So sometimes when God has a purpose, we do some things that are probably not supposed to be, but his purpose will come out ahead of all of that in spite of us. So, when we were talking about that earlier, I think this morning, we were talking about we want to be in control of ourselves. We want to be the one that rules. But realistically, God rules. He'll always rule, and he'll always have his way. And in this case, he allowed Samson, even though Samson had been sinning, he allowed Samson to use that strength to help him there at the Gaza area, the Philistines. Well, let's read on. Afterward, it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Zorach, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him, find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. Well, it appeared again. Here we go again. He loved a woman. He fell in love with Delilah. And he fell in love again for the wrong woman. Always looking for the wrong woman. It's another example of pain and ruin that was going to come down on Samson's life because he did not guard his heart. And that happens to us. We do things on a whim. We do things the way our feelings are, and when it all comes down to it, it usually winds up being destruction or disaster. We need to really follow Christ and follow the plan and the salvation that we have in Christ, and not our feelings. Every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. That's a lot of money. Delilah was also deeply in love, but she was in love with money, not Samson. The 1,100 shekels made up of more than about 140 pounds of silver. I'm not sure how much that was worth in that day, but we would know about 140 pounds of silver today would be pretty valuable. Let's read on. So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me where your great strength lies, with what you may be bound to afflict you." And Samson said to her, "If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." So the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, and she bound him with them. Now men were lying in wait, staying with her in the room, and she said to him, "The Philistines are among you, Samson." But he broke the bowstrings as a strand of yarn breaks when it touches fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Well, here we have this woman. Again, when you go down the wrong path, when you choose the wrong things, you create your own disaster, and he created that. Because now he found this woman who was only interested in money, was only interested in betraying him, only interested in probably bringing him down. But he was so blind with the love for her that he didn't see that. And when she even tried to trick him, he couldn't even see that. And it says that the men were laying in wait in the same room. And, it seems to me he would have kind of snapped to that. But apparently, love is blind. And you can't change somebody's mind when they're in love. So she asked him, "What is the source of your great strength?" Well, it must have been that his strength wasn't obvious to her. That means that he probably was not a large, heavy, muscular man like a modern-day Arnold Schwarzenegger or Mr. Universe or whatever. He may have looked small, he may look skinny, or he may have been unlikely to have such strength, because obviously she was looking at him and said, "Where's your strength coming from?" And then she goes on to say, "Well, what can we bind you with that'll afflict you?" She knew that he was strong because of all the stories, I would imagine, that she had heard about what feats that he had done. Yet she knew that he could be bound with something. And so one might say the honest answer to her question would be, may I be bound with the attention and affection of an ungodly yet attractive woman? Well, she bound him. Samson could have easily seen Delilah's heart by the way she immediately tried to bind him with what was being deceptive to him. But the fact is he did not tell the truth. Also proved that he knew she was had a dangerous intention. And so, I have to think about that. He was blind by her love, but something in him told him not to tell her the truth. Something in him told him, I better not give up this secret. So when this happened and he broke those bonds, they continued on. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Look, you've mocked me and told me lies. Now please tell me what you may be bound with." So he said to her, "If they bind me securely with new ropes that have never been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." Therefore Delilah took new ropes, bound him with them, and said to him, "The Philistines are among you, Samson." And the men were lying in wait, staying in the room, but he broke them off of his arms like thread. Now this is the second time. "Now please tell me how you may be bound." It would seem that the romantic attraction made Samson lose all his senses, because now this is the second time she's petitioned him about that. And there was no good or rational reason why Samson should have continued his relationship with Delilah or even entertained her prying, because she was trying to find the secret of his strength. But this is a good example. Samson provides a good example of how an ungodly relationship can keep warping someone's thinking. Uh, I've counseled several people that, and I look at them and I'm going, what are y'all doing? Uh, there's constant adultery going on, or there's constant betrayal going on, constant lying going on, and I don't understand how these couples can stay together, but yet they still do. I've even seen abuse, and there are women who are abused by men that refuse to leave them. And I don't understand it. It seems like, why would you want to be beat up all the time? I don't get it. But here's a good example of how an ungodly relationship can warp your thinking. It's the second time she's tried to trick him, and he's just going right along with it. Just keeps going along with it. So she took new ropes and bound him, and of course Samson allowed this bondage because he refused to escape from her. He wanted to be with her. And many days, or many people today are in similar places of sin, compromise, and bondage, and they refuse to escape, as I just said a moment ago. And why is that? We get complacent. Unfortunately, sin causes us to be complacent, and we are comfortable with where we are, even though it might be a bad place, even though it might not be better for us. We get complacent, and this is the problem with sin. It entraps you. It enslaves you, and this is where Satan wants you to be, and this is where he wants us to be today. He wants us to think that we're defeated people, we're a defeated foe. He wants us to think that we have no abilities to fight back, and so sometimes people just give up. Sometimes they just feel like, well, there's nothing I can do, so I'll just accept my fate. And in this case, Samson, this is the second time she's tried to trick him, and he should have snapped to that. I used to have a saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Well, hold on. Here's the third time. Here it says in verse 13, Delilah said to Samson, until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me what you may be bound with. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my hair into the web of a loom. So she wove it tightly with the batten of the loom and said to him, the Philistines are among you, Samson. But he awoke from the sleep and pulled out the batten and the web from the loom. And she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength lies. So now she's pulling that old, you don't love me routine. If you loved me, you would tell me. She didn't care anything about Samson. She cared about money. Cha-ching, cha-ching. He continued, though, with his commitment to her in a remarkable blind power of her irresistible love. Not hers, but his love for her. She goes, how can I say you love me? How can you say you love me when your heart's not with me? Well, tragically, Samson's heart was with her. Her accusation was a manipulation to try to get him to do what he really shouldn't do. Well, that weighed on his heart. And you can wear a person down over a period of time. If you just keep going on and on and on and on, you can wear a person down. I'm going to remark to that in just a minute, but let me read the passage first and then we'll remark on it. And it came to pass, verse 16, when she pestered him daily with his words and pressed him so that his soul was vexed to death, that he told her all his heart and said to her, no razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave, and I shall become weak and be like other men. When Delilah saw that he had told her all of his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up once more. for he has told me all his heart. So the lords of the Philistines came up to her, brought the money in her hand, and she lulled him to sleep on her knees and called for a man to come and shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. When she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him so that his soul was vexed to death, that's when he told her his heart. If you remember earlier, Samson gave in to a nagging wife. If you remember in Judges 14. Now he yielded to a nagging Delilah. She certainly sinned by using such terrible manipulation, but Samson also sinned by giving in to that manipulation. Her previous complaint was Samson's love for her was empty and hollow, but Delilah had no love for him, and she expected Samson to destroy himself and his service to God to prove his love for her. So in essence, he gave up a lot to prove his love. He gave up everything to prove his love. And this is where we see Jesus when he talks about you need to forsake your wife, your mother, your father, your children, forsake all of that for me. When we saw Job giving up all of his family for his service to God, there's 2 things that happened there. One is all that came back to him, and Jesus did the same thing. There's a story, I guess I have a little time to tell you, that I heard one time, and I really like it. Jesus approached a man, and the man said, well, what must I do to follow you? What must I do to have you totally in my life? And he says, well, do you have a house? Yeah, sell it. Oh, okay, I can do that. So he sells it. He said, do you have a car? Yeah, sell it. So he sold that. He says, what about a job? Do you have a job? Yeah, quit. Give that up. Okay. He said, do you have children? Yeah, I've got children. Give them to me. He says, but that's my children. That's my flesh and blood. He said, do you want to follow me? Yeah. Give them to me. So he gave them. He says, you have a wife? Yeah, I have a wife. Give her to me. So, whoa, wait a minute. That's the only thing I have left. That's all I've got is my wife. You already took my children. You take my home, take my job. That's all I've got. And he says, you want to follow me? Yeah. Give her to me. So he gave it to him. And he says, well, I don't have anything left. He says, yes, you do. You've got me. And when he realized that really all he needed was Jesus, Jesus gave back all those things that he had before. But see, it took all of that to help this man see that it's Jesus he needed first. And this is the case here. Samson needed God, and he gave up God for Delilah. He gave up God to prove, that I love you, honey. I don't care what you've done to me. I don't care how bad you've treated me. I don't care how you've deceived me. I don't care. I love you, honey. And this is how I'm going to prove it. I'll give up everything that I have made a vow to. So he did. He told her heart. When Samson did this, it was a very sad situation. He had to know what was to come. He faced a choice between faithfulness to his God and continuing in this ungodly relationship. In this we see the strongest man in the world weak under the power of an ungodly relationship. Perhaps Samson figured that because he was strong in one area of his life, He was strong in all areas of his life. But he was wrong. When she lulled him to sleep on her knees, no doubt, Delilah used sweet words. Oh, honey, just lay down here and let Mama lull you to sleep. Let Mama sing to you. Let Mama just stroke your forehead and just, oh, I'm sure it's like our Chihuahua. You put our Chihuahua in a towel and turn him upside down and she's out. That's all it took. When that happened, when she pretended to love him for the sake of money, when that happened, that's when the torment began. We might say that Delilah began to torment Samson long before this. But at this point, his strength was gone. There was nothing magical about Samson's hair. We might also say that Samson began breaking his Nazirite vow maybe way before this. Yet there came a time when Samson finally had to reckon with his rejection of God's great mercy. Now, Spurgeon says this, not that his hair made him strong, but that his hair was a symbol of his consecration and was the pledge of God's favor to him. While his hair was untouched, he was a consecrated man. As soon as that was cut away, he was no longer perfectly concentrated. And when his strength departed him, then his strength departed him. I remember when I was a young teenager in the 70s, we used to grow our hair long back then. And I remember coming up with all those excuses. My dad, he allowed me to do that as long as I kept it clean. But I come up with all those stupid, ludicrous ideas. Well, Jesus had long hair. That was okay. Yeah. Samson had strength because he had long hair. Of course, I was not strong at all. I was kind of a little puny. But I come up with all those kind of tricks and lies. And here in this case, Samson gave it up. He gave it up for the love of a woman who he should have never had been with. But it was a pattern. I don't know if you've seen this in our study. He did that over and over and over. But at this point, he came to a point where he had to make that final decision. He rode that fine line for such a long time. But he came to a point where he had to make that final decision. And see, that's where people are today. They want to ride that little crest, ride that little wave, ride that little line, but they don't want to make a commitment to Christ. If you made a commitment to Christ, it's an all or nothing commitment. And that's what people don't want to do. People want to live in the world and still be called Christian, and it doesn't work that way. It's an all or nothing thing. And so Samson, unfortunately, wasn't all in it for God because he finally gave up and did what he shouldn't have done and broke his vow to God. All right, so what happens to him? Well, verse 20 says, and she said, the Philistines are among you, Samson. So he woke from his sleep and he said, I will go out before and other times and shake myself free. But he did not know the Lord had departed him. It was sad. Can you imagine? Can you imagine Jesus coming back and he's separating the sheep from the goats and you come up, stand up there, and he tells you, depart. I never knew you. You go, whoa, wait a minute. But I cast out demons in your name. I witnessed in your name. I prayed your name. And he says, I never knew you. That's going to be a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people. Because there are a lot of people that are living like Samson. They think that they've got it sewed up. They got it sewed up, but they really don't. Well, he says, I will go out as before. Samson didn't know that things were different. He lived in compromise for so long that he thought it would never make a difference. And this is the tragic example of a wasted potential and rejection of God's warnings. You know, God's been warning us for a long time. It's nothing new. I know we see a lot of new things on the television. We hear a lot of new things. But the old story about accepting Jesus as personal Lord and Savior goes all the way back centuries. The warning's been there: accept him or die. And it's not a new story. It's the old story. Samson thought he could get away with sin and accept his consequences. He misinterpreted the merciful delay of God's judgment and correction as a sign that he really didn't care. He therefore presumed God's mercy and continued on his sin to make things worse. Sometimes we just sin and sin and sin, thinking God will just shove it under the rug. Oh, but it's just a little sin. Oh, but he won't mind this. But what we don't understand, God is God. He's not going to change. He's never going to change. He's the same forever, and he cannot cohabitate with sin. So if you have sin in your life, then you don't have God right next to you. That's the good part about Jesus coming into our life, because we can restore our fellowship with God through the blood of Jesus. But we can't go around thinking that we can sin, and God thinks it's okay. We can't go around and live a life of debauchery and think, well, God will just let us slide. Not going to work. Not going to happen. And apparently this is what happened to Samson. He got away with it for so long, thought, well, you know, it's all good. And all of a sudden now, things are going to be different. He did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Samson's strength was not in his hair. It was in his relationship with God. He worked against that relationship at a point where God finally said, enough's enough. And in the sense that he no longer blessed Samson, he no longer had his supernatural power. So what happens to him? Verse 21 says, then the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters, and he became a grinder in the prison. However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaven. Can you imagine having your eyes put out? Now, Sally just has had some issues with her eyes, and I think Wayne's had some issues with your eyes. Being an artist, I can't imagine losing my eyesight. I mean, you know, I could still talk and I could still do certain things, but I could no longer do drawings like I do. It would be devastating. But they put out his eyes. They bound him with bronze fetters. Now, we think of handcuffs, but I can promise you in that day and time, the kind of fetters they used were very heavy. They were very brutal. They were very abrasive. And they put him on a grinder. I don't know if y'all are familiar with that. But they used to have a grinding mill, and they'd have people, they do it with animals, I think mainly with mules and donkeys, but and oxen probably. But you can be connected to a grinder and go around and around while you're grinding. And you know, that sounds like, well, that's not too bad, but try to do that 24 hours a day and see how long you last. It's a punishment that is hard to bear. But while he was doing that, guess what? His hair began to grow. His hair began to grow back. Sin has its wages, and this was Samson's payday. His sin left him blind, in bondage, and left him as a slave. Before Samson's blindness, bondage, and slavery, they were only inward, but now they were outward. His hair on the head began to grow. God gave Samson hope. In the midst of the dungeon, his hair began to return, and we can suppose that his heart also began to return. This is the great thing about restoration. If you remember when Adam and Eve fell, sad story, and it's sad for all of us because it affected all of us. But even in God's grace, God restored them. Now, of course, it was different, but he did restore them and clothed them. They no longer had access to the garden. They no longer had access to the tree of life. But he did give them restoration. God is going to give Samson some restoration. As his hair began to grow, his strength began to come back. And not only that, his heart changed. He began to understand what it really meant to be faithful to God. When his hair began to grow, what did that prophesy? Well, at first, it prophesied hope. And that's the one thing that we have in Jesus Christ. We have hope. In a lost and dying world, in a world that seems like it's falling apart, in a world that seems like nothing's going to work or nothing's going to happen or nothing's going to be good for us, we still have hope. As long as we have Jesus, we have hope. And in this case, there was hope for Samson. I will be bound to say that he put his hand on his head and felt that it was getting bristly or longer. And then he put his hand to his beard and found, it's starting to get rough because he can't see. Yes, it was coming. Yes, he thought to himself, it'll be all right soon. I shall not get my eyes back. They won't grow back. It's because of my sin that took place, but I'll get my strength back, for my hair is growing. And I shall be able to strike a blow for my people and for God. So let's see what he did. Verse 23. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, our God has delivered into our hands Samson our enemy. When the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God has delivered unto our hands our enemy, the destroyer of our land, the one who multiplied our dead. So it happened, when their hearts were merry, that they said, call for Samson, that he may perform for us. So they called for Samson from the prison, and he performed for them, and they stationed him between the pillars. It's bad enough that they put out his eyes, that they put him in bondage, they made him a slave. Now they want to make sport of him. They want to make a mockery of him. And see, this is what is happening to the Christian people today. And I don't mind telling you that. I don't mind sharing that with you because I think it's true. If you look across the internet, you look across the news, even CNN will have some reports about that. If you're a devout Christian today, you're a hater. You're inflexible. You're one of those people that they're looking out for, afraid of. It's kind of sad, and you really need to research that because it's getting bigger and it's growing more and more against the devout Christian population. Now, not the Christian population per se, the ones who say, well, I'm a Christian. I'm talking about the devoted followers of Jesus who should be inflexible, who should be promoting the one way. Those are the folks that are targeted. We're targeted. Well, God had delivered into our hands Samson, our enemy, they said. When Samson pursued his ungodly relationship, he might have justified himself by thinking that the only harm was going to be done to himself. But here we see that his disobedience led to giving glory to false gods. and Samson became a trophy for worshipers of those false gods. When the people saw him, they praised their God. The message preached by the followers of the dragon was clear. They said, "Our God is stronger than the God of Israel because we have conquered Samson." Often the disobedience of God's leaders leads to others to deny God. I don't know if you remember, I don't like to call out names, but there's been a great evangelists who have fallen by the wayside, who were once cherished by the people, once looked up to, and then they committed a great sin, and it made it look like, they're all like that. They're all that way. And it's not true. One of the greatest evangelists I know was named Billy Graham, and he was never like that. But because of some of the other evangelists that have fallen by the wayside, it makes all evangelists look the same. Unfortunate. Let's finish this up. Verse 26. When Samson said to the lad who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars which support the temple, so that I can lean on them." Now the temple was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, about 3,000 men and women on the roof watching while Samson performed. Then Samson called to the Lord, saying, "O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my two eyes." And Samson took hold of the two middle pillars which supported the temple, and he braced himself against them, one on his right and the other on his left. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he pushed with all his might, and the temple fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life. And his brothers and all his father's household came down and took him and brought him up and buried him in Zorah and Eschatal in the tomb of his father Manoah. He had judged Israel 20 years. Now some say, well, he committed suicide. That's what they would tell you. Well, he committed suicide. No. Now I don't think it was a matter of committing suicide. Samson knew what he was doing. Samson wanted to take one more blow against the Philistines for the sake of God, a blow of vengeance. Now, God had allowed that because God had allowed him to have strength back. It makes us think that all the more Samson was not a muscle-bound man who was naturally strong, but that his strength was truly supernatural, not natural. Samson's end was both bitter and sweet. God answered his last prayer, and he achieved his greatest victory against the Philistines at the cost of his own life. In this, Samson is pictured of the believer as in disobedience, but God used him, but he did not benefit from it. His life ended in a personal tragedy and was shadowed by the waste of what could have been a great potential in Samson. He says, "Let me die with the Philistines." Was this suicide? Nah, but it was different from suicide in the strict sense that his purpose really wasn't to kill himself, but it was to kill as many Philistines as he could. And there was a sense of which Samson was like a modern suicide bomber, but realistically that wasn't the case. He was a hero, even mentioned among the heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Yet there was no glorification of Samson and his end. He was not a glorious hero as some of the suicide bombers like to portray themselves as. Instead, Samson was a tragic hero whose life should have ended much differently. We can also say that Samson's suicide and killing of others was not sought out. The opportunity came to him in a tragic way. It says he pushed with all his might the temple, which fell on the lords and the people who were in it. It could only happen with God's supernatural strength empowering Samson to do so. This shows that God never forsook Samson, even when he was disobedient. God's mercies were there for Samson even in a Philistine prison. Remember Joseph? God was always with him when he was in prison. All Samson had to do was to turn his heart back towards God and receive them. In summary, Samson shows the danger of underestimating our own sinfulness. He probably figured that he had things under control with his own fleshly lusts, with his desire for love, for romance, and sex led directly to his destruction. Samson was the great conqueror who never allowed God to properly conquer him. Samson also shows the danger of being a loner as a leader. Everything Samson did, he did alone. He judged for 20 years and never sought or used help from others. Most of all, Samson is an all-powerful picture of a wasted life. He could have been and should have been one of the greatest men of God in the Old Testament, but he allowed himself to have a wasted life. And that's a good story for us because there's a potential in you. I don't care how old you are. I don't care what your age is. There's a great potential in you to be all you can be for God. And he wants you to be that. And he wants you to be that way. Don't waste that. Don't let that go by the wayside. Don't let sin overtake you. Don't let yourself be complacent with what things are. Always look to what things can be. And they can be anything with God, because all things are possible with him. All right, remember that story. Morning, our scripture comes from 2 Corinthians 12, verses 1 through 10. We're going to talk about the strength of grace